All right, I was going to talk a little bit about something. I think one thing that I need to bring up is how bluegrass music got spread around the world. Because today there is an international following for the music that calls itself bluegrass. And it's fervently followed in a lot of the lands, Australia and Japan and all over Europe now, the United Kingdom. Most of that happened because of the U.S. military after World War II. The occupation forces went into these various countries, and folks in the military, guys back in those days, you had special services, but you also had folks just get together. I don't know whether I've spoken about this or not, but at Bean Blossom about a year before my dad passed away, he and Paul Warren got together and got to talking. And they had both served time in the same prison camp in Stuttgart, Germany. And upon my acquaintance with Johnny Warren a few years after that, I found that in Johnny's household, he didn't even know his father had been in the military till he was an adult, while as a youngster, we were consumed with it. There were models of B-24 Liberators all over the place. But anyhow, these guys, when they went into these foreign countries as occupation forces, they'd have their little country music bands and everything. And I know specifically, I haven't talked to many of the folks from Europe about the situation of where their fathers learned, but in the case of the Japanese, the generation of Japanese that I encountered that first started coming to the United States and playing were the sons of guys who were children when those occupation forces were there. Kazuhiro Inaba, one of the premier Japanese musical artists, his father, some of his early work as an artist, and I wish I had, I've got a little wood carving, maybe I can get you a picture of it later on that we can insert right here, that he did for me one time of a line. He carves decorations for events, for weddings and funerals and such as that over there. But one of his first efforts in life was doing portraits of U.S. military personnel over there. So the first contingency of Japanese were the children of the people who had heard this music through the occupation forces, whether they had played recordings or brought recordings with them or actually played music. The first group that Dick Freeland brought into the United States was a group called Train 45, I think, is Saburo and Toshio Watanabe. At that point, Saburo has adopted his mother's family name Inoue now. But Bluegrass 45 was the name of the group. And they were brought into the D.C. area, and I suppose the exposure to that scene up there led to some of the on-stage antics that they learned about. There were a few things that they did that were reminiscent of the Country Gentleman's Act. As they got more into the show business of what's going on, they were very popular with American audiences when they first came over. They were followed up by groups like It's a Crying Time, and then individuals. They would have individual tours, and Kazuhiro's brother, Masatoshi, came over once. I met him when he was very young and traveling like that. Anyhow, that led to the spread of it, and now in this wonderful world of bluegrass today, in both camps, both the newgrass and the traditionalists, the music that calls itself bluegrass is all about the whole world. Another thing I'd like to touch on, let's see, whack that out. I just wonder, is there anything else I really need to say about that? Because it's funny, it's reflective of everything else. I mean, the Japanese players when I would go over there to play with them, and or to play for them, and they would assemble these bands. The bands would play my recordings, you know, note for note, the way breaks were done on my recordings and everything. Amazing. I was introduced to an amazing group of musicians when I started the World International Band because of a little snafu down at the IBMA one year between the IBMA board and the U.S. Navy recruiting band, the Country Current folks. You know, I was able to put together quality musicians from Australia and Japan and the Netherlands and the northern UK. And I mean, you know, just one of those things. It's turned into a homegrown music. Families play it, they pass it down the way it was done in the old days. It's turned into something else, and you've got a great contingency out there that pulls off the tabs off the internet and, you know, the sound bites and everything, learns how to play like that. Just, it's amazing. People are resourceful, and when they catch the sound of an acoustic instrument, it excites them. And when there's a collective, singular point of reference, that's one of the ways that I saw bluegrass expanding out, because I spent a lot of time in the parking lots. And that'll bring me into my next subject that I'm talking about, which has to do with the evolution of parking lot picking.
Did you tell me on the phone something about the Germans had gotten your dad and Paul Warren instruments for?
Yeah, yes, that was another thing in Stuttgart, Germany, in that prison camp where my father and Paul Warren were both kept. They both were involved in little musical ensembles, you know. Somehow or another, the guards had smuggled them in some instruments. I remember my father said he had a mandolin. There was, you know, guitars around. They had enough to where they could have musical gatherings. Now, as far as having a fixed ensemble of something that they could pull like a band they'd heard on the Grand Ole Opry, I doubt seriously they could do that. But when you go back to the early days in Monroe's home, they didn't, you know, his mom played accordion. There was lots of different instruments in that house. And it used to be, when music was really homegrown music and everything, there were no fixed ensemble arrangements of, you know, if you're playing in the wonderful world of bluegrass and it's home, generally speaking, you're going to have a fiddle and a mandolin and a banjo and a guitar and a bass or and a dobro or some configuration thereof. Now, somebody's going to stick an electric bass in instead of the regular bass. Some folks are going to add percussion to the whole thing. Which brings me to an interesting point that David Greer shared with me one time. How come it is that when a guitar player takes on another instrument, he's sitting there playing the guitar, everybody respects him for his guitar playing, he puts on another instrument like a harmonica, and all of a sudden people look at him like he's even more a musician than he was when he just had the guitar. But you let him take that one extra step. Let him add percussion. As soon as he straps those cymbals to his knees, he becomes the laughingstock of the musical community. Now, how come that is? Now, what was I getting to? The guards getting those guys music instruments, yeah. That's the way my dad said. My dad said that that's the way his happened about that. The guard got them there. Anyhow, they were in two separate bands. There were 15,000 men in this camp there. So I would say that they weren't the only two with their little groups out there that played amongst that, because that had to be a terribly scary thing. Well, always being a prisoner of war, I suppose would be a scary thing. But, you know, this is the first time the cultures around the world. My dad told me that some of the guards had communicated to them some way or another, they as Germans didn't expect us to look like humans when we got there. That the way we had been portrayed, we would be other than a form and figure that they would recognize as their own. I don't know what he meant by that, and I made it a point as we got older to, once that stuff evaporated out of him, he found other, I don't know whether that madness led into his other madness is everything, but by the time I was in my mid-teenage years, I don't remember him waking up with the nightmares running through the house screaming anymore after that. Maybe it was the consumption of music because I played all the time, and any time he had any spare time, he was sitting there playing with me. So some of that, but the madness of when I was really young that was around the house, it really changed itself in complexion by the time I got older and was more able to recognize what was going on. Not understand it, but at least recognize there was something happening here that I didn't hear about other folks having to experience. Or not any of them I knew anyhow. Anyhow, I was going to segue over into the thing of the parking lot picking and all of that. Because one of the things that you have when you have something spread out like people listening to a particular ensemble arrangement is the more Foggy Mountain breakdowns that you can have, the more you can get people involved. Something that's simple that everybody can do. You know, that's one thing that the primal form of bluegrass produced. Some of my last go-arounds at some of the more traditional bluegrass festivals, and as I said, I do used to spend a lot of time out in the parking lot listening to people and picking with them. But the last experiences I had with that, which is probably 5 to 10 years ago now, as I walked through the trees and everything, you still heard the Foggy Mountain breakdowns, the Molly and Ten Brooks, the Blue Moon of Kentucky's, the Salty Dog Blues. So the simple earlier tunes that were out there, the instrumentals have gotten more complex as time goes by, but the songs that people sing, you don't hear many things being sung. One little camp might have an Alison Krauss song, something about some old feeling, and another may don't hear many doing Viva Las Vegas around those things, but anyhow, something else. And to get back to what I was going to talk about here, and that being the parking lot picking. It used to be at fiddlers' conventions, used to be when I was a youngster, that if you saw a band out in the parking lot playing for 2 or 3 hours and walk up to them, they probably were playing the same 2 or 3 songs for that 2 or 3 hours, because that was all rehearsal for that contest stage. It had nothing to do with jamming around and experimenting with such and such a lick to go this way, or such and such a phrase to go that way, or working the accent go here. That, you know, there was nothing that we knew the tunes. We're just trying to polish it up to where we can execute it fully the first time. Now, I talked at some other point in this discussion, I have talked, or I will talk, depending on the editor's choice here, about the difference in a musician who night after night plays that preconceived idea, as a Kenny Baker did, or in most cases Earl Scruggs. He was pretty much that. He established the sound of that banjo, and his breaks only became vehicles. Monroe the same way. After a time, the piece of music is only a vehicle for the expression of the emotional moment that's in the air while that tune is rolling on. But anyhow, that's the way it was at the fiddlers' conventions. After the contest was over, there was an amount of time you got with other people and you played, but it was sort of one of those things you got invited to things like that. I remember the first invitation I got to go out to the Westgate Shopping Center after the festivities over at the Civic Center at Asheville, North Carolina. That's where I met Tut Taylor, Roger Sprung, and Mike Longsworth, and one little deal there. And got to watch those guys pull all those vintage old instruments out of their trunk because at that point they were buying these things, original flatheads, for $100, you know, and original F5s for 200, F5 lowers, and so the pricing was a whole lot different in 1963 than it got up to by the 80s. I think the real price war happened when Stephen Stills paid George Gruen $10,000 for a Martin D45, and then it was off to the races with everything. The other side of the parking lot picking that I would bring in is there used to be country music shows at country music parks. There were places like Sunset Park in Pennsylvania. I worked that in my early days of playing with Charlie Moore. So I saw the thing, what you would have is a little park. They would have a stage area and stage and audience area. The rest of the park, they'd have these little rides, merry-go-rounds and stuff like this, rides, maybe a small roller coaster for the kids, you know, that maybe got 6 feet off the ground while Mama walked up beside the cars and all that. But there was this amusement area like that, and then obviously they had their concession stands. Well, when a country music group would come in there and play, the ones that I worked with Charlie, I remember one time it was Charlie Moore and Farron Young. Charlie was the front act, and Farron Young had his, it's 4 in the morning and once more the dawn and done something or another. Anyhow, we would play an afternoon show. We would start the show about 1 or 2 o'clock and play up till about 3 o'clock. Then there'd be an intermission till 5 or 6, and folks would go out and they'd have their picnics and ride the rides and do all the other stuff that there was to do. And then they'd come back and do another stage show about 5 or 6 and knock it down by 7, and folks would go home. Well, in that interim time between those shows, a lot of these folks who came out to see the shows of Flatt and Scruggs and Reno and Smiley and the Stanley Brothers and, you know, some of the locals, well, I don't even know all that many locals that worked regular. There was Olabelle Reed up around Sunset Park there. I remember her, and the guy who played, maybe his name was Campbell, that played the dobro. That one's eluding me this morning. But anyhow, what happened in that time where everybody was going out in between the shows, Mama's taking the kids over to the rides and everything. The daddies, who were the pickers, would go out in the parking lots and play in between that. And that was your parking lot picking. Show come back on. They put their instruments up and they come back over and watch the pros. You know, Flatt and Scruggs didn't get off the bus. And Josh and Jake and Paul out there hawking songbooks and as hard as they could go and giving away Martha White flower coupons. Reno and Smiley's guys out there selling records and songbooks that they do. But those guys didn't come off of the buses back then. I know somebody in Bluegrass something or another was complaining because Doyle Lawson and Rhonda Vincent didn't stick around to pick after their shows, didn't stay around to play with the people in the parks. Lots of lines of thoughts on that. Anyhow, this gravitates all the way up to the bluegrass festivals. And when that started happening up here in Roanoke, it was pretty much after hours. As long as that show was going on, hell, you had Bill Monroe and you had Don Reno back there, and you had Jimmy Martin, and you had Clyde Moody, and you had the Osborne brothers, and you had Country Gentlemen, and Country Gentlemen were there the second year. I can't really differentiate. They both melt into one to me at this stage in my life. I listened to the tapes together and confused and mixed up so much. It's like one big festival to me both years before they moved to Berryville. But then by the time they got to Berryville, they started expanding the shows. And they had other acts on. Carlton would include some local acts and everything. Well, while that went on, a certain amount of the folks said, well, during this time I'm going to stay out in the camp and eat or do something else. And they started picking out in the camps. Well, by the time people had listened to Charlie Waller sing like a duck for 8, 10, 12 years, and the same routines go down off of these groups that were once sort of novelty, but it was like the new comedians. These new comedians today just got a hell of a task in front of them because they got no place to work out their routines. It's funny when you start looking at recordings and looking at art and what we're doing. And I've probably brought this case up before, but whether or not that I have, it won't hurt to repeat it. All those masters that we heard and all those masters that we watched, like the Marx Brothers, like W.C. Fields, like Mae West, like all those other folks, when they got in front of a camera, all they were doing was recording their routines for posterity. They knew what the duration was going to be from the time they delivered that punchline until that laugh was going to come down. By the time that gag happened, they knew whether it was going to be an instant laugh, whether there'd be a delay and everything. That timing's immaculate in their movies, and that was because it was rehearsed. Well, it was the same way with music back in those days. It's the same way when anybody sees a comic get on stage right now and start going, I heard Chris Rock and Jon Stewart, I think, talking about this one night, is you don't have these comedy clubs where people can go out and rehearse their material and develop. You know, Richard Pryor can't develop Mudbone anymore. And the reason being is people got these blasted cell phones that can sit there and record your whole act. And you ain't even got that routine halfway finished. You've just written the outline of it and you're getting up trying to figure out where to deliver which line or which obscenity to utter at what point that's going to get that laugh or this, that, and the other. And before the routine's even finished, somebody's got you out there on YouTube doing it. So you can't, you know, what are you going to do? Put you a live audience but restrict any recording device that they have. And then you won't have no audience, you know, that participate. Anyhow, it's a hell of a thing when you can't rehearse your stuff in such a way as to really get it down good before you have to set your foolish self down in front of one of these cameras. Parking lot picking today at festivals. I know people that go to Bean Blossom today that never go to the stage. I know people that go to a lot of festivals today that never go near the stage. They sit out in their campsite and they pick. They have fellowship with friends that they only see once or twice a year. You know, somebody from Arkansas gets out to find out what it's like for some guy in Vermont to have gone through that last winter, which was extremely cold or extremely warm or this, that, and the other. That's what they visit about. Jim Piva gets to tell the history of Bean Blossom every year to at least 100 people that come up through there. A great ambassador to the thing. I don't know the last time I've seen Jim walk down near a stage going up there. I wish one of these days that these festival promoters would realize that there's value in having a Danny Jones walk through the campsite at night and be willing to sit down with some folks and play 2 or 3 tunes, because that'll probably be the only chance those folks ever get to play with a bluegrass boy in their life. And I will guarantee you that experience will come closer to bringing those folks back next year than will some fellow on stage down there who sounds much akin to his adolescence with his testicles in a vice, squalling out some song on a stage. Because, you know, I think y'all probably need to cut that out. But that's the way it is. You can walk through Bean Blossom, you can't tell the rollover from one band to another. It used to be you could close your eyes when an act, not hear the introduction for an act, have your back to the stage, just take those things off when that band hit its first note, and within 3 measures you knew exactly who it was. There was no confusing Jim and Jesse with the Stanley Brothers, and hell, their homes weren't even 25, 30 miles apart. They should have been playing the same sound of music and everything, but they developed sounds back in then. Carlton Haney used to talk to me about the sound of the music. What does that involve? And it's the whole shooting match. Some of these guys in the 60s learned how they could recreate it with volume. You know, the whole thing when Terry Knight or whichever one of those guys with Grand Funk Railroad or whatever it was figured out when you get the fluids of the inner ear in motion through real loud noise and everything, it gives a false sensation of being high, a slight dizziness to it that's much like the edges of being high. And when they found that out, all of a sudden you could replace Lawrence Welk Orchestra with a 3-piece band called Cream and still make more, you know, that wall of massive sound. You know, Cream is a pretty good band and all that and had great musicians in it. But one Lawrence Welk show's got more music in it than most of those guys output over a lifetime. When you start figuring all it takes to write the horn parts and to write the lines and write the arrangements, you know, down to the nth degree. Anyhow, that's about all I got to say about this stuff, and about all I got to say about anything, except courtesy and respect.